York, the jewel of the north, situated just below the Yorkshire moors and the dales. An ancient city. These days, it's more famous for ghosts, stag nights and horse racing. But under your feet is a rich history, full of Vikings, Romans and knights. So, let's get stuck into the history of York. With the passing of Queen Victoria came the Edwardian era. You had Edward on the throne, Robert Gascoigne Cecil running a conservative government. Although you have the birth of another party in 1900, the Labour Party, something to rival the Liberals. Long gone were the Tories and Whigs of old. This was a new age, and in York, industry was booming. The city had railways, 3 bridges connecting the 2 sides of the river, and motor cars, emerging out of the age of steam with riding goggles and wind in their hair. In the Foss area, you have a new coal power station, as the city is relying more and more on electricity, as the age of steam becomes replaced by the new technologies that are fit for the 20th century. Even the new tram line goes electric. There's even a cinema. Yes, we're in the early years of filmmaking, and the Theatre Royal had begun showing animating shorts late last century. But these moving pictures, known as movies, were becoming increasingly popular, and by 1908, York opens its first permanent cinema. Actually, it's an old Methodist church, now converted to showing these early silent films. Given it was released in 1902, they would have certainly have seen the French movie Le Voyage dans la Lune, or as we know it, A Trip to the Moon. There's also a new political movement gaining momentum, as thousands of angry women have joined the new suffragette movement that is demanding the right for women to vote. In Manchester, Emmeline Pankhurst is taking the country by storm, playing her famous games of cat and mouse with the authorities struggling to cope with her antics. And York would have its own part to play, as Annie Coulthate, a local schoolteacher in her 50s, hears a moving speech by Pankhurst in 1908 and starts her own suffragette movement. Overnight, she turns from a regular housewife with 2 children and husband to the leader of York's own WSPU. She ran a magazine called Votes for Women and canvassed door to door. Annie would play a decent role with a larger suffragette movement and boasted Pankhurst's daughter Adela as a regular speaker, she herself running the WSPU in nearby Scarborough. In York, Annie Coulthate had Irish-born Violet Jones as treasurer. Jones would make quite a name for herself as well in the north, along with Annie Pearson, another local activist who ran a safe house for women on the run from the police. They were also connected with a dancer called Lillian Lenton, a militant and an arsonist, and she'd lived right up to her own era, because people who remember the 60s and 50s may also remember her as an old woman in her 80s, passing away in 1970. Unfortunately, all their efforts were falling on deaf ears, as soon the world would have bigger problems. As, with Edward VII passing away, leaving the throne to his son George V, another era passes, and once again, war looms in Europe. In this case, a war like no other. York is a garrison town, and efforts were made to prepare for this new outbreak of conflict. Knavesmire was now full of tents as the military took over, and schools were repurposed for military use, but the city braced itself. The East Yorkshire Regiment would soon be deployed at various theatres around the globe, as war erupts all over the world. They served on the Western Front, including the Somme, the Macedonian Front, even Gallipoli. Their actions during the Great War earned the regiment 4 Victoria Crosses, the highest decoration in the United Kingdom. 2 of the recipients would not survive the war. This is Sergeant Harold Jackson and Second Lieutenant John Harrison. Both would die in France. The 2 survivors would live on, Private John Cunningham and Private George Chafffer, and they would live the rest of their lives in Yorkshire. Conscription came into force in 1916, and the citizens of York heeded the call, swelling the ranks of the York Regiment. The problem was, one of the MPs was against the war, and there were others that opposed conscription, especially among the Quakers, who had grown quite a sizable community in the city. Even so, these peaceful religious folk also answered the call once the naysayers lost the argument, and half of the Quaker men decided to do their bit. Unlike in previous wars, which were fought in far-off lands, this time the war had come to York, as on the 4th of May 1916, a dreaded Zeppelin was seen in the skies, dropping its deadly cargo onto the buildings below. 18 bombs over 10 minutes. Damaging buildings, killing 9 civilians, injuring 40. Now regular people were seeing firsthand the horrors of war. From now, shining a light at night time could land you in serious trouble and get you prosecuted, as this could bring death. And this attack, no doubt, only aided to men signing up. And ever since 1914, in the east, again not York but in the east, German battleships had been shelling the east coast, including Whitby and Scarborough. But war cannot last forever, and there was an outbreak of peace following the signing of the armistice. In 1918, on November the 11th, on the 11th hour, the guns stopped. At York Minster, there was a service remembering all that went on. And although it was put together right at the last minute, 10,000 people attended. They got this local bugler from St. Peter's School who played the last post. All workers were given a day off, and bunting soon filled the streets. It was a time for celebration. Also time for women to celebrate, as in 1918, the women won the right to vote. You see, during the war, with most of the men absent, they took charge of the munitions and other places in the industry, playing a vital role in the war effort. This helped the chaps in Parliament make their minds up. And, with war over, It is time to enter the roaring 20s.
Hit it, boys, hit it. Boys. Hit it, boys.
In 1922, there's a football team, York City FC. They'd previously been an amateur club, but now have become professional. And at the time of making this series in 2024, they're still going today in the National League. You've got the Chocolate Works opening, which is basically a large chocolate factory owned by Terry's. This company is growing rather big, selling chocolate all over the country, rivalled by other chocolatiers like Rowntree and the Birmingham-based Cadbury's. There's markets going on every Saturday, and at certain points through the year, there's sheep and cattle markets with thousands of farmers coming from all over Yorkshire, boosting the local economy. These were good times. In 1926, there's a massive workers' strike caused by the idea of lowering wages to miners. And by miners, I mean people who mine, not children. This isn't the Georgian era. Not a popular idea. And the general public, in the north of England and Wales at least, stood by the miners. Welshman and a trade unionist, J.H. Thomas, tried to sort out a deal with the Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. But this came to nothing. So the miners put down tools and took to the streets in protest, backed up by a sympathetic public. The strike lasted 9 days. I mention this because York and the surrounding areas had a dog in the race. They've got huge stakes in the mining industry. But alas, the government and the fat cats in charge, they just played the waiting game. So after a few months of earning nothing, the miners simply had no choice but to return to work. And there we have it. At York Castle, the keep itself has long retired and has pretty much been refurbished, and it's open up to visitors, which it still does to this day. As for the prison opposite, which only holds military prisoners at this point, it ceases doing so in 1929, where it closes its door for good as a prison.
You ain't heard nothing yet.
Instead, it becomes a museum, educating the people of what went on back in the long history of the building, sort of general area. And you can even go around and visit the prison itself and see how the inmates lived in the Georgian and Victorian ages. York was now part of the much wider world. And the problem with being part of a much wider world is that when problems arise overseas, it has an impact here in the UK. Events such as the Wall Street crash, which sent the United States of America into a Great Depression. This impacted the UK also, as the American exports that helped boost the British economy fell by half. York and surrounding areas were hit considerably, as they created resources exported for building this great new world, without the need for building ships, trains, bridges, or the skyscrapers that were dominating the skylines of Chicago and New York. Without the need for coal, iron or steel, well, the Depression led to mass unemployment all over the UK, Around 2.5 million people found themselves out of work. But to top this off, government spending was at an all-time high. The Depression led to mass unemployment all over the UK. Around 2.5 million people found themselves out of work. Malnutrition was rife. Entire families had no choice but to resort to the many super kitchens that were set up to cope with the crisis. Now, during this time, the Labour Party were in power, under Ramsay MacDonald. 1929 had been a close election, very close, and Labour could only form a minority government. Still, government spending was at an all-time high, and despite only being in power a year at the time the Depression hit the UK, the damage only added to the chaos. A team is put together to help mitigate this crisis, led by the Welsh trade unionist we met earlier, J.H. Thomas. They met several times with the government in the hope of levelling the unemployment numbers. Now, enter a highly controversial figure. For a British aristocrat from Mayfair, London, puts forward a motion to sort the problem out. He's an ex-Conservative who's formed his own independent party. He's the infamous Oswald Mosley. In 2 short years, he'll be the leader of the British fascists. So yeah, I think calling him controversial is putting it mildly. His proposed Mosley Memorandum is rejected by Parliament. But with collapsing banks and on the verge of economic oblivion, the government was in crisis. By 1931, even cutting government spending didn't seem to be turning the tide. Now, I'm not blaming Labour for all of this. There's a lot of politics going on, and this was an unprecedented crisis that no one could have foreseen. And they only had a minority government as it is, pretty much neck and neck with the Conservatives. But facing pressure, the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, resigned, and a national government was formed. In the wake of this crisis, sure, MacDonald still acted as Prime Minister until 1935, but both he and Labour were politically finished, as the Conservatives now dominated Parliament. As Britain slowly emerged from this depression, the North took considerably longer to recover. They, after all, had been hit the hardest. For the rest of the decade, England and the rest of Europe, as well as the United States of America, would struggle. Unfortunately, this era of peace would be short-lived, and in Germany, the rise of Hitler's Third Reich once again put the world on the brink of war. And York would be preparing for the inevitable conflict 2 years before fighting broke out, conducting air raids and blackout drills. The familiar Anderson shelters were brought in en masse in anticipation of more bombs falling on civilian areas. They got about around 1,500 of these things, along with over 20 air raid shelters. York was well prepared. And in 1939, war came. Once again, Europe erupted into conflict, and before long, the world. The East Yorkshire Regiment was actually already in India at the outbreak of the war. But there was more than just these chaps. You've got the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, the Green Howards, the West Yorks, the East Riding Yeomanry. Like I said, York is a garrison city. Once again, people were called up. And this time, the soldiers of York put the fight to the forces of Axis. At home, this time York had a number of air bases, which houses many of the planes used during the conflict. And as many factories in the north went about making munitions for the war effort, York-based Rowntree's was no exception. Though they did continue making the staples they were famous for at the time, like Kit Kat and the fruit pastels. But unlike last time, the real threat of the enemy reaching England's shores resulted in the airborne conflict known as the Battle of Britain, fought all the way from East Yorkshire to the shores of Kent. Launching the dreaded Luftwaffe from France, Hitler threw everything he could at the Royal Air Force. But they inflicted heavy losses on the Germans, and the result was a victory for the RAF. At York itself, the air bases would dedicate time in shielding the city from the Luftwaffe that had now begun to blitz the United Kingdom, causing catastrophic damage to the civilian population. And people often forget that there were two blitzes, the main one in 1941 and the Baedeker Blitz in 1942. The second one, born out of spite and revenge. You see, we'd returned the favour and levelled the city of Lübeck. So, here they were again. They got the name Baedeker because the Luftwaffe had acquired a travel book, the Baedeker, and used it to guide themselves to famous landmarks in an attempt to destroy them. And in York, they inflicted heavy damage. The locomotive shed was hit, killing the station's foreman. He tried to save medical supplies and entered the inferno, but he never made it out. The Guildhall was struck, ripping out its interior. Even St Martin's Church on Coney Street wasn't spared. Then, worst of all, the Rowntree's factory was hit. Oh my God! That must have been the last straw. It really got their goat. But, in all seriousness, over 90 people were slain during this raid, hundreds injured. The survivors were buried under rubble in a lot of cases, taking days to be rescued. But in the end, all of the York's regiments were in the thick of it by 1944, stationed all over the world from Burma to North Africa, storming the beaches in Normandy for the D-Day invasions. The new 5th Battalion, created in 1939, being among the first to set foot on Gold Beach. Within a year, the war was won, and the world needed rebuilding. York needed rebuilding. It would take many years to properly restore the city. Factories like Rowntree's and Terry's, yes, I've not forgotten about the other chocolate legend. These factories are handed back to the chocolatiers, who get straight back to producing the products that they are famous for. Kit Kats, chocolate oranges, and the like. Although Terry's stops making the chocolate apple, but only because the chocolate orange is doing so well. Sales are going through the roof, and it's not changed since. And I wonder, is there anyone out there who remembers having a Terry's chocolate apple? It stopped being produced in 1954. That's in living memory. Because we're moving from the pages of the old history and into the now. So many people will remember these things. You'll also see an old custom returning in the form of the old miracle plays from the medieval past. There had been an attempt to bring them back in the Edwardian era, but in the 1950s they were back for good, and still celebrated right up until the modern day. And during the 50s, York embraced the jazz and blues movements, as well as the rock and roll craze that gripped the Western world. Music during these times was diverse, and to quote Van Wilson from the York Oral History Society, it went from "How much is that doggy in the window?" to Elvis Presley. There was a raw energy coming through. But there was also controversy, as many venues didn't want this loud sound. Some people watching this would no doubt have witnessed this firsthand, growing up in this post-war period. No doubt remembering trends long lost, from the warmer milk placed on the doorstep to collecting bottles. And how many other trends in other eras of history have also been long forgotten, possibly even never written down in the first place. Though milk being delivered is still a thing, it never went away. And there are many businesses in the area that deliver to your doorstep, though the old milk floats of the past do seem to have gone the way of the dinosaurs. Going back to music, York certainly embraced the new beat culture of the swinging 60s and had its own cavern club in Micklegate. Though spelled differently than the famous one in Liverpool, this one's got a K. There's also the Rialto Theatre. Beatlemania was the latest craze, and even though the Beatles were not from York, they played in the city on a number of occasions. Yes, it might not seem worth a mention, as many bands played in York, but the song From Me to You was apparently written while travelling on the tour bus from York to Shrewsbury. There's also this. The Beatles only played 2 shows in their career as a 3-piece band, and these were at the Rialto Theatre in York, because John Lennon had the flu, and the first night he couldn't play, and the second night he couldn't play. So there you have it. During the swinging 60s, tourism is really on the rise, forcing York to try to accommodate people who travel to the city, though most people had just stayed for a night or two, and foreign visitors were just 1 in 40. And sod Willy Wonka, Rowntree's are going from strength to strength, following their merger with another Yorkshire-based company, Macintosh. The chocolate giant was introducing more chocolate goods, such as the Lion Bar and the Yorkie. Yes, there's a reason why it's called the Yorkie. It's as Yorkshire as the bird. And you've even got ghost walks appearing, as in 1973, 2 chaps named Peter Broadhead and John Mitchell began to educate the public about the various ghosts that have been seen over York's long and rich history. These walks are still going on now and have been joined by many others. I mean, ghosts are a huge part of York's culture, and there are so many places that have reported sightings, from the Golden Fleece pub, where the apparition of a woman has been seen conducting poltergeist activity. to the Guy Fawkes Inn, where 2 children, 18th century victims of cholera, reportedly haunt the site. Actually, most pubs in York tend to be haunted. I myself went on a pub crawl, and boy, I saw many spirits. Keeping in the 70s, there is also the building of the Coppergate shopping centre. But before construction began on the new centre, the York Archaeological Trust took the opportunity to excavate 10th century structures found beneath. Like 40,000 bits of archaeology were found. Treasure trove, it's brilliant. Items that have found their way into museums. And prior to this, in 1972, a huge turd was excavated in pavement. Not on the pavement, in the road pavement. Yeah, they didn't just find a Richard III on the street. It's in the area pavement. And when I say huge, I mean huge. It's possibly the largest dump ever found. 8 inches long, 2 inches wide. This colossal number 2 was delivered to the world by an unknown Viking during the Jorvik period. The chap was riddled with intestinal worms, and he would have been very ill, probably feeling a bit flushed. And we knew he pigged out on lots of shellfish and nuts, as well as fruit. So, if you want to see King Kong's last meal, then you'll find it if you visit the Jorvik Museum. Right. Anyway, let's leave the gutter, shall we? The Jorvik Museum itself was opened by the York Archaeological Trust in 1984, housing many of these artefacts. Though in our timeline, we're still in the 1970s. Slowly, we're finding ourselves blending that fine line between history and the now. The 1970s is still 50 odd years ago, give or take. There will be some people watching this video who remember these times. They'll remember the opening of the Coppergate shopping centre and the closing of the Foss power station, both happening in 1976. I myself would have only been 3 years old in 76, and I was living in Surrey, not York. I don't remember that year, no matter where we are. What I do know is the 70s was great for music, as was the 80s, and by now we're certainly pushing that line between the now and the then, the future and the past. There will be people born after the millennium, in their 20s, who view the 70s as a part of history. And in just a few short years, in the eyes of time, the Gen Alphas will be in their 40s, looking back at the 2020s with the same eyes we do. It's how time works. It's how we perceive it. And I certainly do not feel the need to explain every shop that closes or opens from the 80s to the 2020s. That would be tedious.
Access granted.
Although I will mention that you have the famous miners' strikes in the 80s, led by Arthur Scargill, This results in the closure of the mines, a highly controversial part in York's history, and one of the reasons why a certain Prime Minister still leaves a bad taste in their mouth. But that's getting into modern politics. There's a difference between mentioning Whigs and Tories in a bygone era to mentioning Margaret Thatcher and Neil Kinnock and Arthur Scargill. That is for another channel, one that deals with politics in the modern era. So, I will mention though that the York Minster Church ends up having yet another fire. It was all over the news back in the day, 1984. Yet the church did what it did best. It bounced back, staying strong as one of the most beautiful churches in the UK. People from all over the world visit the Minster Church, along with the other great sites here. So, as for the now, York's a beautiful city, there's no doubting that. It's one of the best I have been in, one of the best I've seen. It's that perfect blend of the old and the new. Everywhere you look, there is history. In a city as old as the Romans, you'd expect this, though I wonder how many locals in York pass these buildings every day without thinking about the history. They probably see the walls as just one medieval wall, yet there are parts which are Roman. And in other cases, you cannot escape it, such as the many pubs which proudly boast their rich history, like the Guy Fawkes and the Golden Fleece. But then you have one particular pub called the Blue Bell, who openly boasts they are not an historic pub, despite the pub being bloody old. There is also an old church that's been converted into a bar, and this place is pretty good also. As you can see here, it's still got all the old stone architecture from the pillars to the arches. And it does decent cocktails too, so naturally I had a Negroni or two, followed by a Vespa. This is what I mean by the old blending with the new. For someone like myself, who relishes in history, it is perfect. Also, because of the nearby racecourse, there were loads of chaps and chapettes, suited and booted, all ready for a good time. And the pubs were packed all weekend. There were stag nights, lots of people from all over the north, from Manchester to Liverpool to Middlesbrough. This is a thriving city. There's also some shops dedicated to Harry Potter in the old shambles. Something to do with Diagon Alley being partly based on this ancient street. It's disputed, people say otherwise, but whether true or not, J.K. Rowling would definitely have heard of the street the Shambles, and it certainly does bear a resemblance to said alley, although we do expect a queue to enter the shop that must not be named. So, next time you're in York, and you fancy a pint, raise a glass to the rich history of York, and the people that made it what it is, and what it was. From the Romans to the Vikings, to the Normans and the now. And if you don't drink or don't fancy a pint, then raise a glass of whatever you are currently holding. There you go. Thank you for watching.